and was left littered with the wreckage of failed drug flights. Later's old partner, George Jung, had been cut out of the operation a few years earlier. Later himself escaped back to Colombia.
He had intentions of going back to Colombia and taking over the country. And, you know, he idolized Che Guevara, and he was intent on the revolution. As he stated, cocaine was the atomic bomb, and he was going to drop it on America. You know, he had basically begun to lose his mind at that time.
By late 1982, the DEA began to spend more effort on Colombia itself. At first, they knew very little about how and from where the Medellin cocaine cartel operated. U.S. efforts focused mostly on grants to the Colombian police to eradicate Colombian marijuana fields. This focus left the DEA unaware of what was going on deep in the southern reaches of Colombia. The smugglers had established a huge complex of cocaine laboratories here. It was so remote and peaceful, they called it Tranquilandia.
We had a part in that lab, and it was very important because there we could very easily process cocaine. It was in the middle of the jungle.
Newly assigned to Colombia, DEA agent Johnny Phelps suspected that there might be large laboratories, but he didn't know where. Then he had an idea.
We developed a program and an idea, a concept of trying to actually follow chemicals being used in the laboratories to an actual laboratory site. In one case in particular, we were able to determine that the chemicals had reached a destination which we believed to be a cocaine laboratory site. Working with the Colombian National Police, a plan was developed to transport National Police officials accompanied by DEA agents to this site to investigate, to determine if in fact it was a cocaine-producing laboratory.
The bust took place on March 10th, 1984. These pictures were taken by a DEA cameraman. Undetected by law enforcement for nearly 2 years, Tranquilandia produced as much as $12 billion worth of cocaine.
To our surprise, it was a huge complex, not a single laboratory, but a series of laboratories. I mean, it was an industry.
DEA agent Bill Alden had just taken a job at DEA headquarters in Washington. He remembers his superiors gloated over the news.
We were gratified by that seizure, and there were a lot of us that there was a lot of self-congratulation. I mean, because that was such a huge amount, we actually thought that we may have had an impact on cocaine trafficking. In fact, later that year, or later that spring, I made a presentation to the California Narcotic Officers Association in San Diego, and I remember alluding to Tranquilandia and insinuating that we might have turned a corner. I really always wanted to go back and apologize for that later on, because what we thought is if we carefully watched the price, the purity, for the next few months, we would see probably a drop in purity, increase in price, because we affected availability. And we really had an impact. Wrong. There was no impact. There was absolutely no, 22,000 pounds, almost 12 tons of cocaine seized had absolutely no impact on the market at all, on availability, purity. It continued just as it did, as ferocious as it did before. And then we really began to realize how big it really was.
Tranquilandia was one of the 5 or 6 big laboratories that existed at that time in the region.
Pero yo no creo, porque después yo no creo que eso afectó en mucho
But I don't think it affected traffic
en mucho el
much,
tráfico
because there were many labs like
aparte de eso,
Tranquilandia
había
all
muchos
over the country,
laboratorios en todas partes
in many
del país,
places.
en muchas partes.
At the U.S. Embassy in Bogota, U.S. officials knew that to make any real progress against the Medellin cartel, they needed to do much more than burn down labs. Alex Watson was Deputy Chief of Mission.
Our whole idea was that you were not going to have a successful effort in Colombia against either marijuana or cocaine unless you had some sort of political consensus that this was an issue on the national agenda which needed to be dealt with. Just the Americans talking about it alone was not enough. And the most potent weapon from the perspective of the narcotics traffickers was their extradition to the United States, because there was a feeling that given their power and their money, that they could probably avoid being punished inside Colombia.
Extradition was a hard sell. At their peak of power and influence, the leaders of the Medellin cartel were able to command a certain level of legitimacy in Colombian society. Pablo Escobar posed as a sort of Robin Hood. He built neighborhoods for the poor and bought one of Colombia's most popular professional soccer teams. He ran for political office and won a seat to the Colombian parliament in 1982. Drug dollars, billions annually, were pouring into Colombia's economy, causing a building boom in several cities. The cocaine bonanza made the dealers heroes. When Carlos later campaigned for political office, he openly admitted he was a trafficker. When threatened with extradition, these men were able to use their power and popularity to fight what was already a very unpopular idea.
The extradition of nationals is a very sensitive theme around the world. And many European countries will not sign an extradition treaty. I think it's the French still have this, that permits the extradition of one of their nationals to another country. And so there was a lot of pressure on Colombians not to extradite Colombian nationals to the United States. And the Colombian traffickers did everything they could, including spreading money around the political class, making arguments that it was unpatriotic to allow this to happen.
North American imperialism came, the Peace Corps came, and planted drugs, and corrupted Colombia, and planted cocaine. Now, when the Colombians become enmeshed in their system and their dollars, we are then hauled off to the United States to be arrested. The Treaty of Extradition is a trick.
I know that the United States will never do that to any American, like send it to someone else's jail to get punished, especially to a Colombian jail. So same thing for us. I'm fighting for the rights of my people.
A ver, para nosotros la extradición, pues eso nos pareció algo muy
Look,
grave.
for us, extradition was something very serious.
Si a uno lo llegaran a extraditar,
If you were extradited, it would be like being buried alive.
entonces, pues
We respected extradition very much.
mucho respeto a la extradición. Nosotros trabajamos mucho.
We worked through the courts against extradition.
Pero después nos tocó salir corriendo. Nos tocó salir corriendo y Pablo también.
Pablo took another road, which was violence.
No hubiera la extradición, pero ya él tomó fue otro camino que fue la violencia.
Colombian Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla supported extradition. In April of 1984, the DEA learned that the cartel had pooled $500,000 to kill him. Carlos Toro remembers meeting with Pablo Escobar in Haiti.
I was in Haiti to meet Carlos later, and Pablo showed up, and we were having an afternoon lunch, and Carlos and his attorneys and started talking about the situation with the minister being an obstacle to the whole interest of the cartel. And Pablo said it quite clearly that the minister had to be dealt with somehow.
I saw him at a reception of a National Day reception at the Dutch Embassy, I believe it was, And I was chatting with him, as I often did whenever I saw him, and I said, you know, Rodrigo, we're all ready whenever you want to come to the U.S. and take a little breather and get away from all this. We're ready to put you up. It's all set up. And he said to me, no, Alec, I got a few more things I want to do. I want to stay a few more weeks before I go. And it was that night at about 8 o'clock when the motorcycles drove up beside his car as he was going home, and they machine gunned him to death.
In a country used to violence, this killing shocked everyone. Among the assassins were teenagers. The president imposed a state of siege and ordered the army to go after and arrest all the drug traffickers they could find.
And you may find yourself in another part of the world, and you may find yourself behind the wheel.
Back in the United States, cocaine use was still rising.
And you may ask yourself, well, how did I...
Ironically, the administration's major focus was not on cocaine, but on marijuana. The parents' movement was driving the administration's policy.
Thank you.
When Ronald Reagan came into the presidency, he made a very clear public statement that marijuana was going to be made a top priority, because he believed, he and his wife believed, that it was the spread of marijuana among middle-class kids that was really the drug threat.
In prevention terms, it's still, marijuana is the keystone, because it is the gateway drug, and NIDA finally officially agreed with that into the drug culture. So that if you prevent the usage of marijuana, you really have very little chance of other drugs being used.
In 1984, First Lady Nancy Reagan launched her Just Say No campaign and became an unofficial spokeswoman for the parents' movement. The campaign focused mostly on white middle-class kids who had not yet tried drugs, and the campaign relied heavily on private and corporate donations. The Reagan administration actually reduced the percentage of monies spent on treatment and prevention by a third between 1981 and 1986.
Just say no, just say no, no.
If someone offers you drugs, what will you do?
While the focus continued to be on marijuana and kids, by 1984, an estimated 6.5 million Americans